It's raining outside, so I hope that won't be too audible. Um, Often when I make videos about current affairs, I've got some sort of news report to read off. With this one, I'm not going to do that. I'm just going to speak with what's on my mind. Um, those videos I also speak from my mind, but it's useful to have a source to go with. With this one, I'm just talking in somewhat generic terms. Because I feel that it speaks for itself really. Um, it's not really necessary to go into too many details. I'm talking about recent developments in Ukraine and the attitude of Donald Trump. Um, I have to be quite honest. I am thoroughly disgusted with the President of the United States, the so-called President of the United States. Trump is in that office. He's the president. That's that's what he is. But for this man to think that he belongs in the same breath as Lincoln, Roosevelt, Washington is pathetic. It's just nonsensical. Um, to be quite honest, I feel that the real Lincoln of our times, the real Churchill of our times, the real Roosevelt of our times is Volodymyr Zelensky. What that man has been through, um, the enormous pressure he is under, not just from Russian aggression, but from the fact that the President of the United States has put such pressure on him and has not given him the confidence that he should be getting from the so-called leader of the free world. It's for Zelensky to hold up the way he has is incredible. And yes, there has been a lot of support from European leaders, moral support and some arms and other support. But, as a British citizen, what I observe is, and I'm sticking here solely with the Ukraine issue, I'm not going to cover all world affairs in this one, but yes, it's good that Starmer is on the side of Ukraine, as have his predecessors covering this period. That is Boris Johnson, Liz Truss, Rishi Sunak, and now Starmer. So there has at least been consistency in that regard, whether Conservative or Labour, that's good. Um, and I did find it refreshing after that awful Oval Office meeting earlier this year when Zelensky came to London and Starmer gave a much warmer reception. That was good to see. But warm words and messages of solidarity alone aren't enough. What I want to see is Western leaders being a bit more standing up more to Trump. Quite frankly, yeah, condemn Putin. That's a no-brainer. That's just they're going to do that anyway, and rightly so. But I want to see less pandering to Donald Trump. Um, Western leaders need to be saying very clearly this peace plan is an appalling peace plan. I mean, Rubio had to deflect critique that it was written by Moscow. Included in the 28 points is some absurd demands from Ukraine that they reduce the size of their armed forces, that they don't join NATO. And I understand, I don't know if it's part of the peace plan directly or if it's like a side proposition, but the possibility of Russia rejoining the G8, this is utterly grotesque. It's rewarding the aggressor. Of course, it's being cheered on by Putin because it's in his favour. Um, a Ukrainian guy I know who knows his history, he put it bluntly, he said Trump is anti-Ukrainian. In his latest erratic, deranged outburst, Trump again accused Zelensky and the Ukrainians of being ungrateful. The obvious question is, what the hell should they be grateful for in this context? When the Americans are basically saying, give up a big chunk of your country. I mean, it's insulting for the enormous sacrifice the Ukrainians have paid. Yes, they're soldiers, but also their civilian population. I take it personally because I have Ukrainian friends and I have got very close to the Ukrainian community here. So I can't help but take it personally. But if you're British and you don't know any Ukrainians, I would propose this. Even if you think, okay, Ukraine's none of our business, and there are some Britons who think like this, consider the fact that Russia has repeatedly threatened this country. Consider the fact that Russia brought chemical warfare to the streets of Britain 4 years before the invasion of Ukraine, the full-scale invasion of Ukraine. I'm talking, of course, about Salisbury. Russia is not our friend. Russia is an existential threat. And I don't think it's hyperbole to say this is the biggest threat in Europe from a nation state since 1945. There are other threats from China, from Iran, but I think when we look at the aggression coming from Russia, it's unparalleled. And of course, there's extremist ideologies, under no illusions about things like pan-Islamism, and increasingly the far right. Those are serious problems, but I'm talking in terms of nation states. And actually, it's not totally unrelated because Putin will exploit any divisions in our society. Most Britons do support the Ukrainian cause, but I am troubled to see a small but vocal minority of, I'll just say what I think of them, traitors, repeating Kremlin narratives and literally cheering on the Russian side. I physically want to be sick. Because when I see Ukrainian children, and I do, any one of those kids could be those killed at Ternopil, or any of the other places affected by drone attacks recently, if not for the fact that they were in this country. But it just seems that every time Putin is under pressure, Donald Trump swoops in to give him a break. Whether it be letting him set foot on American soil, thus giving him legitimacy as a world leader when he should be treated as a pariah. Or in this case, proposing an outrageous so-called peace deal that insults the victims. And what I find grotesque about this is the Americans put all the pressure on Ukraine. Where's the demands of Russia to stop their aggression? Bear in mind, as this is being proposed, as Rubio claims is great progress, Ukrainian civilians are still being killed. Now, the American attitude is, what's wrong with the Ukrainians? Why don't they want peace? Their civilians are being killed. Why don't they just take it? Nobody wants peace more than the Ukrainians. But the point about peace at the price of sacrificing the country, it's not a true peace. Because actually, it may be a temporary halting of the conflict, but what it will do is encourage Putin for a third invasion. And that's an important point. We talk about the invasion being the big invasion of the 24th of February 2022, but technically that was the second invasion when you consider the annexation of Crimea in 2014. So John Bolton is right. This would embolden Putin for a third invasion. That's unforgivable. Unforgivable. There's a very strong argument to be made that if Ukraine were a member of NATO, what happened in February 2022 would not have happened. Because Putin may be bad, but he's not completely stupid. He wouldn't provoke NATO in that way. Russia's powerful, but its power is far, far inferior to NATO when it's combined. And that is a very important point because we're dealing right now with an American president who grotesquely, perversely seems to be in favour of a Russian dictator. There's no other way to put it. And yes, Trump's apologists might say, well, Trump has condemned Putin in recent weeks and months and, he's notched up the rhetoric and threatened sanctions, for example, against countries that still trade with Russia. Yet Trump is so volatile, so changeable, so vapid, so lacking of integrity that all it takes is a little bit of flattery from the Kremlin, or whatever perceived falsely perceived slight Trump thinks he's got from President Zelensky. You know, in this case, he claims the Ukrainians are not grateful. By the way, that's factually wrong. It's factually wrong because Zelensky is on record, along with other senior Ukrainians and the Ukrainian people themselves, as repeatedly expressing their thanks to the West. I can personally testify to that. So it's just sickening to see this gaslighting of a leader who decent people respect. You know, the way they treated him in the Oval Office was sickening, absolutely sickening to see. It's been pointed out that Vance didn't come out with that line about, well, actually it wasn't Vance, it was Vance's line was about the gratitude thing. It was that so-called journalist that asked why Mr. Zelensky wasn't in a suit. They haven't asked that question of the Saudi Crown Prince. Go figure. I have a theory about this. I think that the Trump administration is fundamentally bigoted, and I think they look down on the Ukrainians. In my opinion, they look at the Ukrainians as just an Eastern European country. You look at the way that Trump speaks to Starmer and Macron and Merz. There's disagreements, but it's not quite as disrespectful. It's just not. And I still think there's a lot of Americans, certainly in the Trump administration, that seem to see this as just two squabbling neighbours. Oh, it's just two Slavic countries fighting with one another. They don't see this for what it is. A powerful country invading a smaller neighbour, brutalising that smaller neighbour, you know, deliberately killing its civilians, displacing millions of people. And I'm going to speak bluntly here because people have to know the truth. Torturing its prisoners of war, raping its women, kidnapping its children, and engaging in cultural genocide. I base that on the fact that they're trying to eradicate the Ukrainian language. They're trying to brainwash Ukrainian children into forgetting their culture. That is cultural genocide. And when I see people defending this or denying it, I really want to jump through my screen and throttle them, to be quite honest. That's how I feel about it. So this situation, I'm not clever enough to know what's the way forward. I don't know what can end the situation, but I do have some loose ideas. I think that one strategy that hasn't perhaps been done enough, and this may be a little controversial, but I do wonder about it. Maybe it's time for the West, Western Europe I'm talking about, to seriously start propping up the Russian opposition, rather than just thinking, okay, there is Russian opposition. Seriously, giving them support and therefore weakening Putin from the inside. I mean, yes, continue to support Ukraine, but so long as Putin is in power, this will continue. That is a fundamental problem. Garry Kasparov has said also that the only way this ends is by a Russian military defeat in Ukraine, because Putin's so entrenched in this that he can't actually afford to just pull out, because then the nationalists in Russia will turn on him. So for Putin, he has to win in Ukraine. So the only way is for military loss. That's not going to happen with what Trump's proposing. And actually, this thing about giving up the Donbass and giving up huge swathes of Ukrainian territory, this isn't just areas that are currently under Russian occupation. This is including towns that have been recaptured by Ukraine. So all that sacrifice, Trump wants them to just throw it out, disregard it. So that's, I think, an outrageous proposal. But how does Russian defeat happen in Ukraine? Unfortunately, the only way I could see it happening is with overwhelming military support from the West. There's one thing I will say about the way Trump is. I abhor Trump. I think he's a terrible president, and I think what he's proposing is awful. But it is true that for too long Europe has been complacent. It is true that for too long Europe has been overly reliant on the United States. Now, I want to be clear what I mean by this. I do not accept this argument that America always comes in and protects Europe. In both world wars, there was huge American sacrifice in Europe, and we should never forget the cemeteries across this continent filled with young American soldiers. So that sacrifice should never be forgotten. But there is an incredibly arrogant attitude from the United States that if they are in a conflict, they alone won it. That is not the case at all. And in both conflicts, there was a vested American interest. You know, I'm not going to get into a huge history lesson here, but it's self-explanatory. Why America came into those wars. Yes, there was moral reasons, but there was also overwhelmingly self-interest at heart. And that's, you know, I'm not condemning that, it's understandable. But that has to be understood, because a lot of the American perspective is about, oh, we have to come in and protect Europeans yet again. Now, they should remember that after September 11th, European troops, I'm talking about Britons, Germans, French, Italians, other nationalities, Poles, they died in Afghanistan. Canadians, of course. They died in Afghanistan in an American-led war as a response to the attacks on New York and Washington. People could say what they want about the war on terror. I personally believe something had to be done after that historic event, but you know, that's perhaps for another video. But the point I'm making here is Trump shouldn't forget that. Trump shouldn't forget that European support at that time, because it was the only time that Article 5 of NATO was actually utilised in that sense. There's another important fact that should be remembered. In 1994, the Budapest Memorandum, when Ukraine at that time was one of, I believe it was 5 countries that had nuclear weapons in that part of the world. Russia itself, Belarus and Ukraine. Belarus and Ukraine gave up their nuclear stockpiles. I believe the others were Kazakhstan and I can't remember off the top of my head, but it was in the very good Cold War series I recently watched on Netflix. But anyway, Ukraine gave up its nuclear stockpiles, and one of the points about that was assurances of Western protection. This was under the Clinton administration. Donald Trump is a very ignorant man. He doesn't have a great knowledge of history, and so he's either disregarding that or he's just ignorant about it. I mean, this is a president who cannot even handle a question in English. A French journalist was asking Trump a question about the West Bank the other day. She was speaking in English, a little bit of an accent, but anyone who's listening could hear clearly what she said. Trump claimed he couldn't hear her, and he deflected it. You know, so this is a thoroughly ignorant man, who in my opinion is devoid of integrity. But that overwhelming military victory in Ukraine right now seems far off. Throughout this war, there's been points where Ukraine has seemed to be on the upper hand. In the Biden years, there were times that Ukraine was getting the upper hand. And there's been numerous victories. But this is a very, very costly war on both sides. And right now, I hate to say this, but it's difficult to see Ukraine having the upper hand. And that is an utter tragedy. And it's more than a tragedy. I think it's an unforgivable piece of negligence, particularly from the United States under Trump. But, you know, Europe isn't completely clean on this, because whilst Europe has given moral support, military support and humanitarian support, I think the big flaw with Europe, well, is twofold. Firstly, we haven't been self-sufficient enough. There has been too much reliance on the United States. But also, we haven't stood up to Trump enough, quite frankly. You know, Starmer and Macron and Carney and other Western leaders still want to please Trump. They still want to be, you know, there will be occasional protests like Starmer saying, well, actually, he's a friend of mine. I just think that there needs to be a very candid calling a spade a spade. It's a terrible peace deal. Starmer needs to be saying that, or at the very least getting on a plane to Kyiv. I'm aware he's just come back from South Africa, but that would send out a message. The argument against that, of course, is American power. Trump is absolutely essential for this to work. But when you have an American president who is so hostile to the victim, who is apparently doing so much to get the back of the aggressor, then I think other countries cannot just kind of observe. They have to speak out. Overwhelming sanctions, as Kasparov has proposed, would also be something. There's already very heavy sanctions, but I think more could be done in that regard. There's talks about cultural boycotts of all things Russian. I do still have mixed views on that one because that could polarize the Russian opposition. If you have, for example, anti-Putin Russians, castigating them solely for their nationality may not be the most productive thing. I'm not really convinced about that one, but I do think that Russia itself needs to face overwhelming sanctions, and the Russian population, frankly, has to feel the pressure, because one of the things about this war is the Russian soldiers who've died have been from the outposts, from Siberia, from far away from Moscow and St. Petersburg. If the Russian population in the big cities start to feel the pressure, if they start to get power cuts, etc., it might bring the war home to them. Now, I do not propose sort of air raids of the kind that Ukraine has faced, because the problem with that is if we start seeing Russian civilian casualties, whilst Ukraine would rightly argue they've been bearing the brunt of it, the problem is it would lose support in the wider international community. So Ukraine must maintain the moral high ground. I mean, it absolutely has the moral high ground, there's no question about that, but it's just an obvious thing because we shouldn't underestimate the power of Russian propaganda. If there were Ukrainian attacks, for example, in a Russian city and there were civilian casualties, unfortunately, because of the power of Russian propaganda, all they have to do is beam that into homes across Africa and Asia, and then Ukraine becomes the bad guys, which of course is absurd, but it's essential that Ukraine maintain the moral high ground. So I absolutely support targeted attacks on infrastructure, for example, munitions factories in Russia, that sort of thing, even power supplies. But there has to be a very, very, they have to be very precise and do absolutely everything to avoid civilian casualties. Leave the war crimes to Russia. Let Russia be exposed for their brutality, because it's plain to see. Now, I see things there that I can't even begin to process how the people involved would. One man was burying his child and there was a little coffin. I can't even begin to process how someone goes from there. I would imagine there is obviously the deep, intense pain of loss, and deep, intense rage towards the aggressor. So I would never ever presume to tell Ukrainians how they should feel about Russians. I just think that polarizing Russian dissidents is not the best way forward. But I do think that Western leaders need to put pressure on Trump rather than constantly pandering to him. Also need to support Zelensky, and they have done that, to be fair, but particularly at this time when he's under so much pressure. And I think that giving support to the Russian opposition, and I'm not just talking about those who are politically opposed to Putin, but those who recognise, because this is one of the sticking points that the Ukrainians, perhaps with some justification, point out. There's Russian opposition who will criticise Putin, but they still have kind of nationalistic ideas about Ukraine. So to be really authentically on the right side, those Russians need to unequivocally say this was an aggressive war against Ukraine. Ukraine is a sovereign country, and if there is any sort of takeover in Russia, if Putin is replaced by any one of these leaders who may be, I mean, it's hard to say who would do that right now because we know what happened to Navalny, but if there was that sort of situation where a more pro-West leader took over, they would have to accept Russian culpability, which would mean major reparations. Um, you know, frankly, what Germany and Japan had to accept after World War Two. That's the sort of situation that any replacement government, after Putin would have to accept. I'm not talking about another Russian nationalist. I'm not talking about Putin Mark II. Lavrov's a bit old, but who knows? Medvedev might try his luck again. He's in his early 60s, so it's not inconceivable. But I watched the film Nuremberg, and I'll finish with this, with Russell Crowe, Rami Malek, and Michael Shannon. Very good movie. But I was thinking, we're looking there, 1946, people like Goring and Stryker and so on in the dock. I would love to see a day when Putin, Lavrov and Medvedev are in the dock. Unfortunately, I don't think it will ever happen. But that would be a remarkable thing. Anyway, that's how I feel about this situation. I'm not even Ukrainian, and I just feel so strongly about this, because you can't know people and not be personally affected by what's happening. And I've just so much respect for the courage that they have. But that respect for Ukrainians is also matched by my total disgust at Donald Trump and the insults that they come out with, saying that the Ukrainians aren't grateful, whilst telling them you need to give up a big chunk of your country, you need to reduce the size of your military, and you have to accept the aggressor being welcomed back into the international community. It's grotesque. There'll be a huge amount of pressure on Zelensky, of course, to reject this deal. Actually, if Zelensky accepts it, he would suddenly become very unpopular in Ukraine, I suspect. And that's understandable. I do have sympathy with Zelensky for the enormous pressure he's under. What he said was, we're in one of our most difficult decisions of losing a key ally or surrendering our country. That's not verbatim, but that was the gist. But is America an ally? Trump might say we've sent weapons, but these double games that Trump is playing, it's that ambiguity is just unforgivable. Trump shouldn't be ambiguous about this. He shouldn't be neutral. As the so-called leader of the free world, I mean, I don't think Trump deserves that title at all. But as American president, he should be unequivocally on the side of Ukraine. It's just a no-brainer. And yet, you have an American president who is pandering to the Russian dictator. It's just grotesque. Imagine if Kennedy in 1962 had said, the American press are all fake. Nikita Khrushchev is right. Imagine if Reagan had turned around and said, the Soviet system is not the evil empire, but, we've just got fake news in America that makes them look bad. Or, these sort of things. We have an American president in 2025 that is more pro-Russia than pro-West. That's the truth. And it's grotesque. And his cult base can't see it, because they're as ignorant as he is. It's I find it sickening, to be quite honest. And the day that Trump is out of office will be a good day, but 3 more years to go. Ukraine can't wait out 3 years, and that's why this is such a tragedy. But the United Kingdom, Canada, Germany, France, Italy are not small countries. They don't have to just go along with everything Trump says. They can be more assertive. And I think they should be. And with that, I'll wrap this up.